The book of Daniel, not Second Peter anymore. If you were here last week, you noticed that we finished out that series. We were working our way through the books of First and Second Peter over the last year or so together as a church. And so one of the things we like to do is we work our way through different books of the Bible, which is the norm around here, generally speaking, on Sunday mornings. We also want to make sure that we preach the full counsel of God's Word, which means that we go to a large variety of books, including Old and New Testament and different genres. And today, we are going to begin a series which will probably, Lord willing, which will run to around Christmas as we work our way through the book of Daniel. You know, Daniel is one of those books that that kind of is a favorite, especially if you grew up in the church. I know it was always a favorite of mine. Anyone who gets, anytime there's man-eating animals involved, it seems to pique the interest of young Christian boys. But that was part of it. But sometimes it's also one of those books that perhaps that's the first and last time we revisited a lot of it, except for maybe some curiosity or confusion about some of the prophecies that exist in there. And Daniel is one of the books that I think is going to piggyback quite well off of what we've been looking at in 1st and 2nd Peter. Especially in 1st Peter, Peter reminded us as Christians, and then in 2nd Peter, which was talking so much about the Lord's return, we are continually reminded in those books of our ultimate home, and that this world is not our home, and that we are on our way to our heavenly home one day when the Lord returns. And so, while we await for that, we live as exiles here in this world. We're called and so this in the sense that this world is not our ultimate home. And 1st and 2nd Peter had a lot to say about how we live as such. You know, a number of years ago, I was with some of you, so some of you will remember this. But a number of years ago, I was in Senegal, West Africa, on one of our church's trips out there, and it was kind of the first trip I had taken after my wife Wendy had our kids, and so they were really young at the time, and she wasn't able to be there. But it was one of those trips and while I was there, I caught malaria. And so I remember calling home and to let my wife know that, hey, I'm fine, but I have malaria. But I remember the feeling at the time that all of a sudden I felt very far away. Now, of course, I hadn't actually traveled any farther. I'd been in Africa for a while at that point. But that sometimes what happens is that when we're far from home, the feeling of being far from home kind of is compounded anytime we go through some sort of trial. I think that's the nature for us as Christians. We know, many of us at least, hopefully, that we are, as Christians on this earth, we are far from home. We are far from heaven at this point. We know we are exiles in this world, as we're told in the New Testament. And there are times when I think as Christians, as we live in this world and as we face different things in this world, that feeling of being far from home becomes compounded ever more. Oftentimes that happens when trials set in, when suffering sets in, health challenges set in, etc., etc., etc. We feel oh so far from home. I don't think it's any secret as we look at kind of our own small corner of the world here in America. I don't think it's any secret to say that Christianity itself is far less at home in our small part of the world than it used to be. I think for many of us, we may feel less at home, quote unquote, in this world than we ever have before. Now maybe that is because maybe we felt too at home in the past in this world. Maybe we felt more at home than we ever should have. But I think sometimes what happens as culture changes, as trials surface, we begin to realize oh so clearly that this world is not our home and we feel far away. And Daniel is a book, if nothing else. It's not just a book of prophetic curiosities. It is a book for those who are not at home. For those trying to live godly lives in a world that looks very different than their home world looks. It's a book for those who live in a world that feels overwhelming and powerful in its influence, all while the Lord, as we saw last week and in 2 Peter, is bringing about his kingdom. Daniel is going to show us, not just as we saw in 1st and 2nd Peter with describing and talking about and teaching through more of a logical, progressive form of what godliness looks like as we make our way home, but Daniel is going to show us what godliness often looks like when one is far from home. But it's going to do so in a way that is often done through the source of narrative, as it uses an example of an individual, namely Daniel, and some of his young friends, at least at the beginning of the book. Daniel gives us narrative instruction in a lot of these ways. Daniel, after all, as we'll see, is a man who lived the vast majority of his life away from home, away from the promised land. We'll talk about that and give some more background in a few moments. And it's a wonderful display of godliness in that realm. And so what I want to do this morning as we introduce the book of Daniel, as we talk about some of the background of the book of Daniel, and as we really try to wrap our heads around and our arms around this first chapter in the book of Daniel, I want to see three things. Three things that we begin to see in the book of Daniel, and they're not the last time we're going to see them. We're going to see them on display numerous times throughout this book. But first, we're going to see the world's strong influence. The world's strong influence. But then we're going to see the believer's surprising obedience. And thirdly, we're going to see God's sovereign control. The world's strong influence, the believer's surprising obedience, and God's sovereign control. To start off, we'll read through the whole chapter eventually, but I'm going to start with the first 7 verses, where we begin to come into contact with this empire of Babylon. And we begin to see the strong influence. Then that's the first point we're going to see here, the world's strong influence through a world superpower at the time. So I'm going to start by reading verses 1 through 7 of Daniel chapter 1, so I invite you to follow along with me. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and languages of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. Right away in the book of Daniel, as we've just read that portion, we're thrown right into the mix of some pretty profound world events. Right away, we are coming into contact with the names of kings and kings falling and kings rising and rulers conquering and overthrowing. The book of Daniel itself, the whole book, if we're trying to put it in the context of world history, it seems to start somewhere around the time of 605 BC. And the final date that seems to be mentioned in chapter 10 seems to have been somewhere around 537 BC. So the book of Daniel itself is going to cover what seems to amount to about a 70-year period, all of which covers the life of Daniel, or at least a large portion of his life, while he lives in the nation of Babylon. Babylon, of course, like as often happened and as still happens in this day and age, but even in the ancient Near East, you would have the rise and fall of empires, and empires rising to the surface like Assyria, and then them in some sort of decline, taken over by another rising power, and Babylon was on the ascent during this time. Babylon was a great and powerful nation. It should go without saying. And as Babylon expanded its ever-growing power, one of the peoples that stood in the way of them was, of course, Jerusalem, specifically Judah. Portions of the overall kingdom of Israel, especially the northern kingdom, had fallen under attack previously. But Babylon now sets its sights on, and as she rises, sets her sights on Judah, the southern kingdom. And as Babylon expanded, we know of at least 3 different times when Jerusalem was attacked. And our text here seems to highlight the first time in 605. It happened again in 597, and then a final fall in 587. You can read about it, most of it if you want, in 2 Kings chapter 24. A lot of it's described there. We see here, it seems to be the attack or the overthrow of Jerusalem, or at least the first one that took place in around 605. And as would often happen in that day and age, when a king or an empire would overthrow a people, he would allow some to stay in the land, to stay in their homeland. Indeed, there were some. You can read other books in the Bible and in the Old Testament which talk about some individuals who were kind of left behind in the promised land as a shadow of itself. But also, what kings would also do is they would take captives and bring them back with them to the capital where they ruled and reigned. And those captives would often either be prisoners of war to be executed or individuals that could be used in some way in this new world, in this new society that they're living in. And that's what we see happen with Daniel being one of them. Captives who were of noble and influential birth, who are brought back to be re-educated, essentially, to be in service in the nation of Babylon. I want you to notice here as we read how Daniel recounts what happens, that Daniel goes to great lengths to emphasize what appears to be an overwhelming religious defeat of Israel. You see, in the ancient Near East, especially when one nation conquered another, that was not just seen as one having a stronger military than another. It was that, of course, but it also was seen as one God being stronger than the other. I want you to notice a few things in these first 7 verses which Daniel goes great length to emphasize here. We'll revisit some of these details later on, but one of the things I want you to see, first of all, is that we're told in verse 2 that some of the articles from the temple, from Israel's temple, are taken and brought back to one of the temples in Babylon. You know, Babylon was a land that was very impressive religiously, especially when you compare it with Israel. Sometimes this is overlooked. You know, Babylon was a place with hundreds of gods, more than 50 temples, as far as I know, hundreds of shrines and altars. Had overthrown Israel now, a place with one measly temple, one altar for sacrifices. It was a stark contrast. Again, in that day and age, it was a stark contrast between, and sometimes we read the temple imagery in the Old Testament and we think, wow, that sounds really impressive. It was not by ancient Near Eastern standards. Compared with the lavish religious images that were on display in much of the ancient Near East, Israel was kind of way behind the curve, at least it appeared that way. One temple? Why would you have one? You can have as many as you can possibly build. We see here that now these implements that were used in the worship of Yahweh, the one true God, they have now been brought and taken into the temple of the gods of Babylon. I want you to notice also what Daniel highlights and emphasizes in verse 2. Verse 2, halfway through, you'll notice that King Nebuchadnezzar, he brings these vessels from the temple to the land of Shinar. Now again, that word probably doesn't mean a whole lot to us. It pops up here and again in Scripture. Probably today seems to be somewhere around southeastern Iraq. But the last time, if you were to ask, when's the last time we heard about this place called Shinar in the Bible before Daniel? Well, we heard about it before, all the way back in Genesis chapter 11. It's where the Tower of Babel took place. Here is now, there's a sense in which you read through this section, especially as an Israelite, where it feels like biblical history has been put on rewind. Gone back to before Abraham. Gone back to before the temple, to before the promised land. All the way back to the Tower of Babel. The last time rebellion against God was basically institutionalized in trying to build a tower to heaven. What has happened to the Lord's plan to bless the nations through the seed of Abraham? These are questions that seem to be raised. What's happened to all that? It appears in these first several verses, at least especially from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, it appears that the God of Israel has been robbed, has been defeated, and humiliated by the superior gods of the Babylonians. The pieces of Israel's temple are now being used to glorify a false god in another land. It looks like the end of an era, and in a lot of ways it was. We are entering into a really a new world, especially for these Israelites who are being brought to live in Babylon. But there's another way that we see, it's not just that we see religious superiority, it's not just that, or at least the appearance of religious superiority, or the appearance of military superiority. We also see the appearance of conformity. Look what the king Nebuchadnezzar does. He was no slouch. He was no fool. He knew politics. King Nebuchadnezzar, he knew how to wage a military war, but he also knew how to wage a war for hearts and for minds. And that's what he did with many of these individuals, especially as you start to read from verses 3 through 7. Notice what the king did. Once he defeated this kingdom of Israel, of Judah specifically, he brings back some of these youths. And he specifically picks some of the cream of the crop. We're told that in Israel, these were individuals who were born of royalty or of nobility. They have great appearances. They look strong and healthy. They're skilled. They're wise. They're knowledgeable. They have understanding. They show a competence for learning and education. And ultimately, they look like good, promising individuals to serve in some way, shape, or form, basically in the Babylonian Empire, in the administration of Babylon. I want you to notice what are the things the king does here with these individuals as he brings them to Babylon. There's an attempt to make them Babylonians. There's at least 3 or 4 different tactics that you can see here that are done by the king Nebuchadnezzar. He isolates them, he instructs them, he feeds them, and ultimately he renames them. We see that he isolates them, these young men, Daniel and 3 friends. We'll get more of them in the coming weeks. Daniel and these 3 friends, virtually and most likely children at this age or at this time. Most likely ages between 13 and 17, given how long Daniel was in this land. Young men. Now, not all of the Israelites or the Judaites were removed from their promised land, as we mentioned, but some were, and Daniel and these 3 friends were some of those individuals. And he isolates them. Nebuchadnezzar does. He takes them away from their homeland, away from their religious influence, away from their comfort and their social support, and brings them into this new land of Babylon, at least for them. But not only does he isolate them, he instructs them. Notice that he puts them into a 3-year training program, a 3-year educational system. It's free education. And the Babylonian education, by those standards in the day, they were no slouch. They were very advanced technologically and educationally. These young noble men, Daniel and his 3 friends, they're taken from Israel, and they're taken with the ultimate purpose of serving in high positions in the Babylonian administration. But first they need to be trained in Babylonian administration. So he educates them. They're going to learn, but they don't just learn, again, in the ancient Near East and in Babylon, you don't just learn math and writing and arithmetic. They also learn the polytheistic myths of Babylon, the legends and all these number of other things that are wrapped up into this, the language of the Chaldeans that we see here. It was a 3-year program that they were to be involved in, to train them to serve the king. But not only does the king provide education, he provides food, we're told. We'll see this more in a moment. They're going to eat from the king's table. They're going to drink the king's wine, which, in case that's not clear, that means the best. The king generally eats and drinks better things than most others in the nation. The king doesn't just use the sword, but now he's fighting for hearts and minds. He's trying to convince and win over and educate and re-educate and feed and make reliant upon the best of the best. And just in case that's not enough, we're told that these individuals, Daniel and his 3 friends, they're renamed. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. These individuals, their names are changed from names that reflected Yahweh and the God of the Bible, to names that reflected various false gods in Babylon. For example, Daniel, which means God is judge, is renamed Belteshazzar. As you read down the list, all are various names that include different Babylonian deities like Marduk or Bel or Nebo. The name of God is traded for the name of these Babylonian deities. For example, Abednego likely means servant of Nebo, one of the Babylonian gods. It is somewhat interesting that when you read through it in the Hebrew, and it comes across in the English too, the actual writing of their new names is actually, and I think intentionally, misspelled a bit. Seems to be a subtle jab and reminder that though they are named after these gods, they change one or two of the letters in their new names, just as a subtle reminder that it's not really their new identity. But here we see that Daniel and his three friends, they have been subject to overwhelming military force. They're facing a new religion that looks like it's just been overcome a weaker religion. They're facing a powerful education system. They are isolated from where they once lived. They are indoctrinated and they are incorporated into the life of Babylon. Doesn't look good, does it? It seems like really there's going to be one or two options for Daniel and his friends. Oftentimes it's one of these two options that we still think sometimes as Christians are all for us. It seems like there's one option is either Daniel and his friends, they're going to have to just reject everything and probably be killed, or somehow isolate themselves in some Jewish ghetto, or they're just going to have to conform to this overwhelming Babylonian power, one or the other. I think many of us, we can relate to that sort of feeling and how things appear, at least in these first 7 verses. The world and its influence often feels overwhelming, doesn't it? Whether it be through education, whether it be through entertainment, how in the world do we compete with that? When we just get together in this little building once a week and maybe for a Bible study during the week. And we walk out these doors and we face a world that feels like every message that it's trying to get across has everything and every method behind it and everything going for it. What hope is there for our Christian identity? Well, as we're going to see, this is only so far one perspective on what's been going on. We're going to revisit these same verses because you may have noticed I skipped over a word or two, and that's intentional, because we're going to come back to it. But even in the midst of this kind of overwhelming pressure from the world to conform, we see in the midst of this, our second point, the believer's surprising obedience. The believer's surprising obedience. Let me read for us now the rest of our text in verses 8 through 21. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food to be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh, and all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the kings had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. So we're left at the end of the first 7 verses wondering how are some of these individuals, especially the ones that have been named for us, how and if they will stand. And I say a surprising obedience, not because it's necessarily surprising to see godly people doing godly things, but I do think that it is surprising when we see the ways in which Daniel obeys. It's surprising because now Daniel's obedience is done in a very different context. He's not in the promised land. There's no more temple. Now he's living in Babylon, away from home. And we were left wondering, are they going to conform to everything and then maybe get ahead in Babylonian society and move up the ranks? Or are they just going to reject everything out of hand and die, perhaps? And as we see Daniel's response, there's some surprising things here that we sometimes skip over, maybe even unexpected. The things displayed here, they're not the things displayed here. In fact, we're going to see the same pattern from Daniel and his friends as well, but Daniel is going to take up most of the book. Daniel is going to repeat these same strategies over and over again throughout the book. That's a kind of a cycle that you see in the book of Daniel. There's a rising threat. Daniel does something and reacts in a certain way. There's some sort of danger involved or looming danger, and God preserves him. And you'll see many of the same types of things being done by Daniel. Just to kind of summarize some of the obedience we see from Daniel and his three young friends here, there's several things we can look at. First, we see that Daniel begins with a commitment. Look at verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself. This comes, again, look back at verse 7, because this verse 8 is in direct contrast to verse 7. They've just faced all this kind of re-identity or new identity that Babylon has tried to enforce on them, culminating in these new names with Babylonian deities. But in contrast to that, Daniel now is resolved not to defile himself. Daniel, even though he's now in this new land and in this new situation and this new world really for him, he is resolved to be holy, even in this place. It's the type of commitment we see reflected in Psalm 119, 106 of, I have sworn an oath and confirmed it to keep your righteous rules. And Daniel has done that here. You know, there's something wise and good to remember here as Christians as we live in a fallen world and a world that sometimes opposes us either in message or in other ways. As Christians, we would do well to begin with a bedrock heart commitment not to be defiled, to be holy, to be righteous. We've seen talk so much about that in the book of 2 Peter. Daniel is a man of conviction. He's a man of firm resolve. Now at first, oftentimes, I want you to think about this, usually when we think about and hear someone who is a man of conviction and resolve, usually what we think of is someone who is also a bit harsh and hard to get along with and doesn't budge on anything. That's why some of what Daniel does is surprising here. Because Daniel is a man with an underlying commitment to purity and holiness, but it also, not only does he have a commitment, the second thing we see from Daniel is that we see courtesy. Courtesy to Babylonians. You know, one of the things we'll get to in just a moment, what Daniel actually did in his courage, but sometimes what we do is we skip ahead to Daniel and his rejection of the food. He refused to eat the food that the king offered to him, he and his three friends, and we'll get to that in a moment. That's where Daniel said, no, we're not going to do that. And we're going to highlight that in a minute, but sometimes I think what we also need to see is to also first remember how much Daniel said yes before he said no. He said yes to a lot of things in this new land. And I think sometimes where Daniel chooses to draw the line might surprise some of us. Daniel did not draw the line at education in Babylon. He didn't draw the line at even the name he received in Babylon. Now, of course, that doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form that Daniel bought into the education he was receiving. In fact, we know just the opposite as the book of Daniel unfolds. Daniel gave himself to these things, and we're told in verse 17, actually God even gave them success in this educational system. Daniel didn't draw the line at his career opportunity to basically be trained to serve in the administration of Babylon, who had just conquered them. He didn't draw the line at his name, even though they had the names of pagan deities in them. Instead, Daniel draws the line at food. Good food at that. But I even notice when Daniel does draw the line, notice how he does it. We're already told Daniel is firmly resolved in his own heart, but Daniel comes with a request to those who oversee him in Babylon. He comes to an individual, and the individual, the overseer of Daniel, he's like, look, That's an interesting idea, but it's my head that's on the line. So if you show up before the king looking skinny and weak and out of shape, it's my head that's going to roll. And that might sound like an overstatement, but it wasn't. We'll see that more. Heads would roll at times. If you were lucky, your head would roll sometimes. There were worse things even. And Daniel didn't lack courage, but he had great courage, but he didn't lack respect and courtesy either. So he says, look, test us for 10 days. Do a little experiment. Let us abstain from the food and just feed us with vegetables and see how we look after. And that's where we see Daniel. Not only is he a man of commitment and a man of courtesy, but also a man of courage. Anytime you are defying or doing something against what the emperor says, there is great risk. We're going to see this over and over and over again in the book of Daniel. And there's a lot of wondering about why Daniel drew the line at food. And to be honest with you, the book of Daniel doesn't tell us exactly why Daniel chose not to eat the food from the king's table. There's lots of speculation, probably two main options or possibilities. One thing that we should say right away, just given in our current context, is Daniel here is not promoting some sort of health plan. There is out there a best-selling Christian book from a Southern California megapastor called The Daniel Plan, 40 Days to a Healthier Life, based on this text. Daniel is not a health nut trying to hold on to his slim figure in Babylon. That's not what's going on here. So hopefully we can put that aside. There's a couple of options that could be why Daniel does this. It could be a concern for ritual impurity. We do know that one of the ways that Israel was defined in the ancient Near East by what she ate or didn't eat. There's obviously a concern, especially in a foreign land, that any of the food, especially the best food, would have been food that would have been first offered to idols. And of course, Daniel knows there's no way to control or filter through all that, so there are some who think that perhaps what needs to happen is that they didn't eat this food because they didn't want to run the risk of eating any sort of food that hadn't been prepared right or had been offered to idols. A bit like trying to navigate life in this world with a horrible food allergy. You know, there's no guarantees about how food has been handled, and so you sometimes just have to say, okay, I'm not going to have any of this. That could be one reason. It's a little hard to see why the vegetables would be okay, because likely all the foods would have been offered to idols in some way. So all of the food in the nation would have had some sort of pagan roots. I'm not sure if that explains it all, but it's possible. Another option could be the more broad idea simply of the fact that often, especially in that day and age, is that eating from one's table meant fellowship and really almost entering into covenant with that person. It's one of the reasons we have communion in our churches. It's a way that's part of what we do to solidify the body of Christ. We do it together as a church. A king who wanted a people totally reliant on him for everything, education, and even food and drink. Food often had the idea of cementing bonds of fellowship, and there's some of that rings true even for us today. They would seal things with a meal quite often. So it seems likely that perhaps Daniel, he can take the education, he can take the political appointments, he can take the new name even, but he can't take the idea of entering into some sort of covenant relationship of the king's table. He's a man of God, after all, not a man of Nebuchadnezzar, ultimately. Perhaps it was some mix of these two. But the Lord, of course, honors their tactics, as we see. And Daniel and his friends were told that at the end of this trial run, and indeed, finally, at the end of this 3-year training period, they're 10 times better than everyone else. All the magicians, all the enchanters in the kingdom, sounds a bit like Moses and Aaron back in Egypt, putting to shame the magicians and enchanters in Egypt. We're told that Daniel is given wisdom in dreams. That's going to become an issue later on. We're going to see that later on. Daniel and his friends, when they reach the end of this 10-year period, even though they've had nothing but vegetables, they look healthy. We're told they even look fat. Now, that might sound like unhealthy, but standards were a little different back then. They look plump. They look healthy. They look fit. They're wise, they're skilled, they know the Babylonian education better than any of the others, 10 times better, even though they don't believe it. So we see here, and again, we see that you'll notice that a lot of this shouldn't sound all that different from what we see a lot in the New Testament. Whereas we come to living in an alien world, we oftentimes are wonder begin, what are our options? Is it total isolation, total rejection of everything, or is it conformity? And Christians, both currently and in history, have tried both tactics. Either isolate, lock ourselves behind a big wall, either literally or metaphorically, or just conform. Times are a-changing, and the church better change along with it and everything she believes. Are those the only two options? Of course, the New Testament, 1 Peter and Paul and others, they say, look, we are to come with a firm resolve to be holy. We have been made holy by the work of Jesus. We've been cleansed by his blood. But then we're also told to navigate our lives in this world away from home with respect, with submission, and with honor to others as much as we can, as much as depends on us to live at peace with all men, Paul says. Paul also acknowledges sometimes, even as much as depends on us, it's not possible. And we see Daniel doing just that. In fact, you would see this in other portions. Even the prophets would sometimes tell Israel living in Babylon that they would say, look, pray for the well-being of where you live, because your well-being is tied to it. That's why we're told to pray for where we live and those who rule over us. We see Daniel essentially living out a very New Testament ethic in Babylon. But that's not all we see in this text. We don't just see surprising obedience. We don't just see what looks like the overwhelming control of Babylon. The third and final thing I want to see is God's sovereign control in all of this. Go back to verse 2. Who is the one in verse 2 who gives Judah into the hands of the Babylonians? It's the Lord. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his, Nebuchadnezzar's, hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. Skip down to verse 9. Who gives Daniel favor and compassion when he brings his request? And God gave Daniel favor and compassion. Skip on down to verse 17. Who gave Daniel and his friends success in the world at the time? He said, as for these youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Do you see what's going on here? Because Daniel comes in the context of biblical history as well. The idea that Israel was overthrown by Babylon was not, or at least should not have been, a surprise to Israel. It was said long ago that this is what would happen. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 47 through 49, it was basically foretold that Israel was going to disobey the Lord and not keep the law. We read there in 28, verse 47, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joyfulness and gladness of heart, because of the abundance of all things, therefore you shall serve your enemies whom the Lord will send against you. Fast forward the tape a little bit, and you get prophecies that are even more specific about what will happen to Israel. In 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 18, the prophet Isaiah spoke to King Hezekiah in Judah. At this time, and during the reign of King Hezekiah in Judah, there were two threats. There was the Assyrian Empire, which was kind of on the decline, and the rising Babylonian Empire that was on the rise. And so it seemed for a little nation like Israel, like, look, we've got to pick a horse in this race. We're too little, so we either got to get on the side of the Assyrians or get on the side of the Babylonians. And you want to pick the winner. And King Hezekiah engaged in some diplomacy with Babylon. Some visitors from Babylon came with gifts and treasures, and Hezekiah showed them the treasures of Israel. And the prophet Isaiah condemned Hezekiah. Babylon had given him all these gifts, not because Babylon was overwhelmingly generous, but to gain the support of Israel. And the prophet Isaiah told Hezekiah, he says in 2 Kings 20, verse 18, "And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Here are sons of nobility now being taken away into the kingdom of Babylon in the book of Daniel. So you see, when it says that it is the Lord who gave Jehoiakim, who was the king at the time of Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar came in initially, it is the Lord who gave Israel into Babylon's hand. God is simply exercising his own faithfulness that he said, this is going to happen, my people. This is going to happen. And while this might not sound like great news, it's also important to see that we see from beginning to end, Israel is in God's hands ultimately, not Babylon's. Babylon may have a great army. It might have an impressive religious system. It might have an enormous and powerful education system. But it's the Lord who is doing this. It is the Lord who sent Israel here. It is the Lord who brought Babylon to overthrow Israel ultimately. Yes, there's all these secondary causes in world history that happen, and those are all fascinating and wonderful, but ultimately it's the Lord. You know, as Christians in this world, it can feel like our fate is completely in the hands of the powers of this world. Whatever decisions they make or decide, whatever laws they make, whatever values they communicate, it can easily be for us that we feel like, what's the hope? We're just subject to whatever those whims are. And yet from beginning to end through Daniel, even as we see these great powers on display from another perspective, and from the more important perspective, we see that it is the Lord who is at work here. Even if all the powers and systems are against the Lord, we are still in the Lord's hands as his people. Not even a sparrow falls to the earth without the Lord's knowledge. And there's a great little verse right at the very end, which you might have skipped over, but verse 21. "And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus." Basically, what happens in chapter 1 is chapter 1 takes us from the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar basically to the end of Babylon's reign and to the next rising power. We're going to see this in the next coming weeks. Takes us all the way to King Cyrus, some 70 years after Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Persia. In chapter 1, there's almost a little bit of humor here, because in chapter 1, by the end of chapter 1, Babylon's already gone. Nebuchadnezzar's gone. Now, we're going to see in the coming weeks, we're going to backtrack from there and go back and see what happens in the lead up in the coming years, leading up to ultimately to King Cyrus. But right away, there's this subtle reminder that Babylon doesn't last forever, nor does any empire for that matter. And Daniel, this is going to be one of the great and repeated themes in the book of Daniel, is the rise and fall of what are often monstrous and impressive regimes in history. But all of it is to make way for one kingdom that shatters them all. In fact, you can skip ahead to the book of Revelation and see Babylon as a name that is used to describe the whole entire world system against the Lord that ultimately falls in the face of the Lord's kingdom and the new creation. So right away in Daniel chapter 1, we see that the Lord is still at work. Daniel has survived as God's man. That this raging kingdom, with all its strength, with all its resources, with all its abilities, with all its tactics, Daniel's still there, and the Lord is still there. Daniel's all the way there, all the way up to King Cyrus. Nebuchadnezzar's not. As we've learned, and as we'll continue to learn in the book of Daniel, we are called to be like Daniel, with a firm resolve for holiness. And I think often what we're going to find as Christians is that we often fall off into one side of one ditch or the other on either side of the road. We see the ever-changing world and we think, gosh, I just need to isolate myself completely. I just need to hunker down and wait it out until the kingdom comes. Or we say, look, there's no hope. Why stand against it? The world's changing and we better get in line. God forbid we ever become irrelevant. I mean, there's the scariest word perhaps for some. And here we see Daniel, who is a man who is resolved in his own heart to live a holy life. But he's resolved in his own heart to live a holy life in a land that is far from home. He lives a holy life, and he's going to do it again and again and again and again. He does so with respect, with generosity, even in surprising ways to the authorities that are placed over him. That's not because Daniel is a man that likes to just talk smooth words. It's because Daniel is a man who knows that it's the Lord who put them there. He trusts in the Lord. It should remind us ultimately, because I think one of the things that happens is we come to a book like Daniel, and we come away ultimately thinking, gosh, we all better just dare to be a Daniel. We just got to be more like Daniel. And then we go out these doors and we go like, oh my, I was not like Daniel. Took me about 5 minutes. You see, one of the things we see in the book of Daniel is a book that is going to cross over empires. Because years and years after Daniel is going to come another man in the midst of another empire ruling the world at that time. And that man is going to appear to have been conquered by that world that opposed him and opposed the ways of the Lord. So much so that he was ultimately killed on a cross. But 3 days later, he rose. He ascended to the right hand of the Father. Daniel is by no means the epitome of the man who lives righteously in a fallen world. Daniel is simply pointing us ahead to the one who is going to do that perfectly and completely, because not even Daniel did. And even if Daniel was a great and godly man, which of course he was, he in no way paid the penalty for the sins of Israel or the sins of God's people. There's going to be another, Daniel's going to talk about him. He's going to talk about him as the Son of Man. We're going to see that later on in Daniel as well. And I hope that's where our hearts can land as we take and prepare our hearts for communion now. We're going to get in, as we get more and more into this book of Daniel, and hopefully have laid some foundational principles. We're going to see a lot of these things play out over and over again in different ways. We're going to see various threats to bring about conformity in the life of Daniel. Sometimes it'll be tactics like winning hearts and minds. Sometimes it'll be much more severe tactics like do this or we're going to feed you to the lions or throw you in a furnace. And we're going to continue to see Daniel. We're going to continue to see Daniel's friends being godly, being gracious, being humble, being even respectful in ways that will sometimes boggle our minds. But all of it is not done at the end to hold Daniel up as the Son of Man that we are to look to. Just the opposite. Daniel is ultimately pointing to and going to be talking about and prophesying about another who's going to come, who's going to do everything that no prophet, no priest has ever been able to do before. And let's turn our hearts and minds to him, Jesus Christ, the Son of Man, who lived a perfect life, poured out his blood on the cross, all for our sins. Who showed us that oftentimes, even in the midst of what looks like failure and what looks like being conquered by the world, is actually God himself overcoming the world. Musicians, why don't you come on back up?